Welcome to Convention Days 2021. My name is Stephanie Fries, and I am a program specialist here at Women's Rights National Historical Park. I'm honored to present this year's keynote speaker, Carol DuBois. She is one of the nation's leading historians of women's effort to gain the right to vote. She was educated at Wellesley College and Northwestern University. Ellen has taught at the University of Buffalo and for the last 3 decades at the University of California at Los Angeles. Among her many books on women's suffrage, her most recent, published by Simon and Schuster in February 2020, is Suffrage, Women's Long Battle for the Vote. This is the first comprehensive history of the 75-year-long United States women's suffrage movement to appear in more than a half century. She has also written about women's rights movements internationally and is the co-author of the leading textbook in U.S. women's history, Through Women's Eyes in American History.
As I begin my work on a major biography of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, I'd like to speak today about her memoir, along the way commenting on some of the challenges that face me as her biographer. 80 Years and More is one of the great autobiographies of American history. In my judgment, along with that of Benjamin Franklin, Henry Adams, Jane Addams, and Frederick Douglass. What Stanton has to say, and importantly, how she says it, speaks across the century to women today in a way that perhaps no other 19th century woman could have done. Like all great autobiographies, 80 Years and More should be approached as a work of literature, not as a simple mirror of a life. We have learned that photographs cannot be taken at face value, because the photographer's artistry is always involved in crafting the image to bring out her vision. It seems obvious to me that the same is true of autobiographies. We know that biographers' bias must be taken into account in shaping their version of a life. Autobiographies are no different, except that the author and the subject are the same. Like all great feminists, Stanton used her life for political purposes, to illustrate the great obstacles women faced to full freedom and how to live one's life so as to break through to genuine self-realization. Stanton created 80 Years and More through versions she told over many years. This makes her autobiography somewhat different from, and the distortions in it more deliberate and political than most other great autobiographies. I'm going to organize my talk around two categories. One, the important issue of Stanton's racism. The other, what I have been thinking about her ancestry, her parents and her great-grandparents. Stanton, first the issue of racism. Stanton and her story have been subjected to 2 related criticisms, at times amounting to outright dismissal of her entire historical legacy. Some, suffrage historians actually, have criticized her for what they regard as excessive claims to movement leadership in what they have called a, quote, master narrative that she imposed on and distorted suffrage history in favor of her own dominant role in it and to the exclusion of others, notably suffragists of color. Another line of criticism focuses on Stanton's nativism and racism, especially in the 1869 debate over the 15th Amendment. This criticism is particularly serious, both because of its contributions to the claims of white dominance in the suffrage movement and because of the damage it has done to Stanton's historical reputation. Coming to terms with Stanton's racism and elitism is perhaps the biggest challenge facing her biographer. As a woman who made major contributions to the abolition of slavery, not the least her work in building popular support for the 13th Amendment, I find a simple and overarching assertion that she was a racist, unnuanced. Nevertheless, how to deepen and explain this part of her legacy? I propose several approaches. First, as historians now recognize, Stanton herself grew up in a home with enslaved people, and she ignores this fact in her memoir. Her father owned 2 slaves in 1820, and after New York's full abolition, one free African-American adult man lived in their home. Some context is useful here. Slave owning was commonplace in New York, in the entire state in the early 19th century. 10% of Johnstown's residents in 1810 were slave owners. These enslaved people were unlike the Southern slaves we think of, who were members of plantation gangs. They were house servants, day laborers, usually 1 or 2 in a single household. How did this slave come into the Cady family? Perhaps Stanton's mother, Margaret Livingston Cady, whose father owned at least 3 slaves, brought one enslaved person into her husband's household as her dowry. Perhaps it was someone she grew up with, someone who, as was frequently the case in these families, had been, quote, given to her as a companion when she was a child. Stanton does say, without specifying their status, that there were 2 Black men and 1 Black boy in her household. And one of these, who she names Peter, figures significantly in her tales of childhood. He was sometimes known as Black Peter, a name that probably comes from Dutch Christmas celebrations. Peter Thibaut, who lived in Johnstown in these years, fits her description. Tall, dark, very distinguished. We know that Peter Thibaut was born in Albany, was married to Maria DeBent, also from Albany, owned a small house on or near the Cady property by 1830, and may have had sons who fought in the Civil War. Was Peter Thibaut her Peter? Was he a slave in her childhood years? As of now, we do not know. In any case, Stanton's memories of, quote, her Peter are extensive and warm. As she tells it, Peter was the one person in her early life who cared lovingly for her and her younger sisters. Stanton herself became an extremely loving and playful mother, and it is almost as she offers Peter, the character Peter, as the model for her own motherhood. What does Peter's prominence signify about Stanton's attitude towards Black people? Does she offer this idealized portrait as a cover for her childhood experiences with slavery? Author Kathy Kern thinks so, saying, quote, deliberately or unconsciously, Stanton shielded her readers from the truth of her family's slaveholding. Stanton herself says the opposite. In an interview given in 1895, just about when 80 Years and More was published, she said, quote, I am not sure, try and follow these double negatives, by the way. I am not sure that my warm interest in the whole colored race had not its origins in the strong affection of my childhood, my love for old Peter. A second explanation for her repeated expressions of racism and elitism can be found in an important incident Stanton recalled in 80 Years and More, when, standing up to a nursemaid, she declared that she would no longer, she was a child, as a child, declared that she would no longer abide by the constant attempts to control her and became determined from then on to defy what she called the everlasting no, no, no. Whether or not this incident occurred, the best and the worst of Stanton can be found in what she is telling the reader about her stubborn insistence to go her own way. The more daring and radical and even offensive, the better. When she dared to speak out against her society's conventions about women's disfranchisement, their reproductive obligations, their sexual silences, and the restraints placed on them by clerics and biblical authorities, she was stubbornly and boldly taking her stand against the everlasting no, no, no. While these forward-looking radicalisms make her eminently admirable to modern readers, her determination to speak out during post-war Reconstruction against the enfranchisement of immigrant and former enslaved men while leaving all women behind may also have as its source her determination to speak what is not supposed to be said. It was a different kind of resistance to the everlasting no, no, no. I do not ask that she be forgiven for her racism and elitism about the extension of the franchise to these men, former slaves, despised immigrants, but rather to capture something of her stubbornness of character at this and other similar moments, her willingness to say out loud what others might have been thinking but dare not say. If she is supposed to hold her tongue, she will be damned if she will do so, and if it gets her into trouble, all the better. More than once, Anthony sought and failed to restrain her. Third, the racist and elitist facets of her childhood, of her character, may also be fueled by what both her contemporaries and historians have noted, which is her deep-seated sense of superiority to the common run of humanity. When her lofty self-confidence developed, I do not know, as the only two early documents I have found in her hand, a commonplace book when she was a student at Troy Female Seminary, and a letter to her uncle, the wealthy landowner Peter Smith, written when she was 17. These documents show no evidence of the self-confident violator of feminine norms that she would become. By the time she met and married Henry Stanton, however, she had become the forceful and compelling character that we recognize, who won his heart and impressed Angelina Grimke when he took his bride to meet her. Stanton's sense of individual superiority was usually subordinated into a general devotion to securing the rights of all women. But when confronted by great political disappointment, this sense of superiority led her to rage and resentment against those she considered her inferiors. It was at these times that she reverted to highly objectionable racist and nativist language. It's been pointed out to me that psychologically speaking, a person's sense of superiority can flow from rage against what is even deeper than that, a sense of inferiority. And it can be directed against those who are even more marginalized. In Stanton's case, she may be despised as a woman, but at least she insisted at such times she was not a slave, Black or Irish. Stanton's clearest statement of this belief in her personal superiority and the rage associated with it can be found in a very interesting 1884 exchange when she wrote in solidarity to Frederick Douglass, who was also criticized by contemporaries for unseemly arrogance, to protest against the tremendous criticism Douglass was subjected to for his second marriage to a white woman. This is what Stanton wrote. Douglass, I have suffered, this was a private letter. Douglass, I have suffered all my life just as you have. You have endured one curse, I another. To be the equals, yea, the superiors of those who have the impudence, very interesting word, to prescribe our spheres is enough to exasperate a saint. I know that with your intense pride and self-respect, you have suffered perhaps more than any other American slave that ever trod this planet. I know I have suffered more than any woman I have ever met. As she wrote to Anthony after Douglass died, I loved him and he loved me for the indignities we alike endured. Before I leave this issue of racism, I want to read a comment by the great writer, Ta-Nehisi Coates. In a review he wrote about 10 years ago, of Christine Stansel's book called The Feminist Promise. It's really interesting. It's one of the great It's one of the great embarrassments of first wave American feminism that so many supporters of women's suffrage turned against the 15th Amendment using the grossest racial politics. And yet, he wrote, I find myself in sympathy with both Stanton and Anthony. The two spent much of their early careers very much devoted to the cause of Black people and took their share of abuse for it. When their goal, abolition, was achieved, they hoped for some reciprocity. Frankly, given the sort of gender bigotry that women abolitionists face, I'm a little surprised that Moore didn't take the absolutist path. I think of Stanton misstepping, but always pushing, always agitating, always expanding, and I feel a strong kinship. I don't need my personal pantheon to be clean, but I need it to be filled with warriors. It's always struck me as a very important set of observations. From the issue of Stanton's racism, I want to move on to the second issue I want to discuss, her parents and her grandparents, and what they might tell us about her character and its determinants. 80 years and more is remarkable for the near absence of Margaret Livingston Cady in her daughter's telling of her early life. Like her own mother and so many women of her generation, Margaret Livingston Cady had multiple pregnancies and was pregnant almost continually from her teenage years to at least her mid-30s. From the 11 births we know of, and there may have been more miscarriages, 3 or more, all boys, died as infants or young children. Historian Elizabeth Griffith has hypothesized that Margaret was depressed after the death of so many children. And it is true, when Margaret's childbearing years were over, a visitor to the household found her a, quote, spirited woman. By contrast, Stanton herself gave birth also multiply to seven times, all to children who lived to healthy adulthood. Perhaps a testimony to the improved gynecological medicine, but certainly to Stanton's own homeopathic regime. In any case, Margaret Livingston Cady was largely absent from her daughter's account of her childhood. The curious absence of any attention to her mother is further compounded by Stanton's own manifest pleasure in bearing and raising children, and even by her repeated dependence on her mother once she had children herself. Her mother's influence must lie somewhere behind this, if only as a negative model for her own playful, engaged motherhood. This remains a mystery for me. Part of the answer to Stanton's underplaying of her mother, no doubt, is the great emphasis she placed on her father. Daniel Cady was not just the shaping force of Stanton's childhood. He had enormous standing in his community and profession as a skilled jurist, admired as far away as New York City. Elizabeth's husband, Henry Brewster Stanton, who wrote an admiring obituary of him, recalled that, quote, he dealt little in rhetorical embellishments, but wielded a ponderous logic and ground adversaries to a powder. You know, as I read this, I never realized one could say all those things about Stanton. The young men he trained in the law were not just his sons-in-law, but many who went on to become New York legal notables. And to that list, we might add his legally distinguished daughter. To read of Daniel Cady's career is to travel through the all corners of New York's juridical community. He served both in the state legislature and in Congress for one term, just as Elizabeth was born, and as a longstanding member in the state Supreme Court. He was a specialist in equity, which Mary Beard has taught us was a kind of law that women could turn to find better protection for their property than what regular common law provided. He was, to be sure, a member of the ruling class of Johnstown an important figure in New York politics as a Federalist, then a Whig, and finally as a Republican. And he served as a leader in many local reform organizations, especially temperance. Now, when we search Daniel Cady on Google, he shows up as Elizabeth Cady's father. But he was a towering figure in his own time. Given all this, it would hardly be surprising for the young Elizabeth to be dazzled by him, or for the aged Elizabeth Stanton to highlight his prominence in the telling of her life. He was both a model for the position of authority and influence she herself wanted to wield, and certainly the great source of her knowledge of the law, her reverence for its power, and her determination to achieve for women the political rights to shape the law. There is one other family member in addition to her parents I want to mention, because I think his influence on the young Elizabeth was important and maybe not sufficiently recognized. In 80 Years and More, she mentions with great pride her mother's father, James Livingston. Contrary to what some have claimed, James, though a member of that large, powerful, rich Dutch American clan, belonged to a collateral branch of the Livingstons and does not seem to have benefited exceptionally from the family's wealth or standing. What he did bestow on his granddaughter was a deep personal connection to the American Revolution and to the establishment, laying the ground of American republicanism. In 80 Years and More, Stanton remembered her grandfather as a great hero in the American Revolution. She tells the story of his most famous service, which, when posted across the Hudson River from West Point, he observed his superior officer, General Benedict Arnold, surreptitiously meeting with a notorious British spy on a British ship anchored in the river. On his own initiative, James Livingston fired on the ship, captured the British spy master, unable to seize the traitor Arnold, who fled first to New York, then to Great Britain, where he served his adopted country and lived a long time. James Livingston's role in this legendary episode in the American Revolution was a source of great pride for Stanton, who believed she had inherited faith in her own judgment for bold action from her grandfather. Before the Benedict Arnold incident, at the very beginning of the American Revolution, James Livingston was living in Montreal, where he had moved with his father a decade before. There he was approached by officers of the Continental Army and was asked to gather supporters of the Patriot cause. He did, and proceeded to play a major role in the campaign to bring Canada into the still forming independent American nation to become what has sometimes been called the 14th colony. For this, he was honored by the Continental Congress. When the siege of Quebec failed, Livingston fled with the remains of his forces south to Albany, where he had probably been born. As refugees, they were, quote, practically penniless. Livingston repeatedly pleaded with General George Washington for rations and payment to support them. After the Revolution, James Livingston settled in the frontier settlement of Johnstown, where his regiment had billeted during the war. There he and his wife, Elizabeth, had the last 4 of their 9 children, beginning with Stanton's mother, Margaret, who was born in 1785. At age 16, Margaret, James Livingston's tall, striking daughter, caught the eye of a recently arrived country lawyer, 12 years her senior and several inches shorter. Margaret Livingston and Daniel Cady married and settled in Johnstown. And there they raised 6 children to adulthood, living down the street from Margaret's father. James Livingston began to reaccumulate wealth when the Continental Congress awarded him about 1,000 acres of former Loyalist and Indian lands in Western New York and Ohio to compensate for his losses as a refugee. He lived in Johnstown until 1832. By then, Elizabeth was 17, and she no doubt visited him, probably frequently. James Livingston's other famous grandchild, the son of his eldest daughter and land magnate Peter Smith, was Elizabeth Cady Stanton's first cousin, the wealthy and influential abolitionist Gerrit Smith. Visiting her cousin, sitting at his dinner table, was where Elizabeth Cady's lifelong career as a reformer had its roots. Back to James Livingston, we do not fully appreciate how close Stanton's generation was to the American Revolution. In her case, made all the more meaningful by her relationship with her grandfather. When Stanton associated herself with, quote, the daughters of Jefferson, Hancock, and Adams, she was, I think, in her own mind, being quite literal. Just as Daniel Cady had imbued his daughter with a deep belief in the power of the law, and cousin Gerrit Smith had led her into the world of social and political reform, grandfather James Livingston represented to his granddaughter the magnitude and glory of the battle to create the American Republic, the sacrifice made so many in nation building. Here then was rooted, I believe, her determination to expand the Republican legacy to women, to the daughters of those revolutionary warriors. Stanton still draws partisanship. Most either love or dislike her. I have been described, sometimes accused, of being too enamored of her, and I plead guilty. When I lived in Buffalo and came to Seneca Falls frequently, I would imagine I can talk to her. Eventually, my solution to my fantasy of her as my feminist mother was to write a biography of her daughter. And from Harriet Stanton Blatch's perspective, I could see the complexities, the downs as well as the ups of being her girl child. Now I think I am ready to attempt a genuine biography of this great figure, to grapple with her strengths, but also her weaknesses, in a unified portrait of her character and achievement. Thank you.